He woke up in chains. No memory. No name he could be certain of. No explanation for why he was here or how he had arrived. Just white. Infinite, absolute, suffocating white stretching in every direction with no walls, no floor, no ceiling, no end. And he was not alone. Millions of other figures were chained beside him in that emptiness, equally confused, equally afraid, equally without answers. Then a voice came. Not kind. Not cruel. Simply vast, the way a natural disaster is vast, without malice and without mercy. It told them the rules. Welcome to the God game. Prove your worth, or die entertaining him. God was the creator of the God game, a brutal and deadly contest designed primarily for his own entertainment. He did not hide this. He announced it with the calm confidence of something that has never needed to justify itself to anyone. The game would run in rounds. Each round would demand something different from its participants. One wish would be granted to the sole survivor. Upon the bodies of millions, one would remain to claim it. The rest would perish. Most of the participants begged or wept or raged against the chains holding them. Ray Yen did none of those things. He listened, he processed. And somewhere beneath the amnesia and the fear, something old and dangerous began to stir. The other participants were not ordinary people. Warriors from countless worlds, mythological beings, creatures of power that had survived things Ray Yen could not yet imagine. And then there was Ray Yen. No memories. No apparent abilities. No weapon. No allies. By every visible measure he was the least dangerous person in the game and everyone around him knew it. They looked at him the way experienced fighters look at someone who wandered into the wrong room. With a mixture of contempt and dismissal that is somehow worse than hostility. Ray Yen was anything but strong, but did he have a buried secret that could help him survive? The first round was about to begin. And the answer to that question was going to cost lives to find out. The first round did not ease anyone in gently. It demanded blood immediately and without apology. Participants who had been strangers moments before turned on each other with the particular desperation of people who have been told that survival requires someone else's death. The void filled with the sounds of combat, with light and fire and the particular silence that follows when a person is removed from existence entirely. Ray Yen moved through it using something he could not explain and did not yet understand. Instinct that felt older than his body, reflexes that arrived before his conscious mind could form a decision. He survived the first round. He could not fully explain how. But something inside him was waking up. Ray Yen wielded a glaive. When the weapon first came into his hands it felt less like picking something up and more like remembering something. The way the grip settled against his palm. The way his body automatically adjusted its weight and stance. His muscles knew this weapon even when his mind did not. And when the power came, when whatever was buried inside him cracked open even slightly, the air around him changed. Other participants who had been watching him with dismissal took a step back. Ray Yen had the same eyes as God. Nobody understood what that meant yet. Not even Ray Yen, but the game had noticed. And God, watching from his incomprehensible distance, leaned forward with something that might have been interest. The God game was designed to isolate. To make every other participant feel like a threat, because statistically they were. Alliances were fragile things built on the shared understanding that mutual survival was temporarily more valuable than individual advancement. Ray Yen was not naturally a person who trusted easily, or at least the parts of him that he could access were not. But the people who found their way into his orbit were not the kind that were easy to keep at arm's length. Each one carried their own history, their own wounds, their own reasons for needing the single wish that waited at the end of this nightmare. Together they were improbable. Together they were something the game had not fully calculated for. The God game was designed to isolate. To make every other participant feel like a threat, because statistically they were. Alliances were fragile things built on the shared understanding that mutual survival was temporarily more valuable than individual advancement. Ray Yen was not naturally a person who trusted easily, or at least the parts of him that he could access were not. But the people who found their way into his orbit were not the kind that were easy to keep at arm's length. Each one carried their own history, their own wounds, their own reasons for needing the single wish that waited at the end of this nightmare. Together they were improbable. Together they were something the game had not fully calculated for. The memories did not return all at once. They came in pieces, at the worst possible moments, when Rei Yen was already pushing his body past its limits and had no room to process what the fragments meant. But one image kept returning with more force than the others. A girl. Young. Someone he knew with a certainty that went deeper than conscious memory, deeper than anything the amnesia had been able to erase entirely. His supposed purpose in the God game was to find his sister. She was somewhere in this game, among millions of participants scattered across rounds he could not yet see the full shape of. He did not know if she was alive. He was going to find out. That purpose, sharper than any weapon, became the thing that kept him moving forward. The eyes seemed to have been given to Rei Yen by God and were a manifestation of God's divine power in Rei Yen, as Rei Yen was God's candidate and champion. When Rei Yen finally understood what he was looking at in his own reflection, the implications took time to settle. He was not simply a participant who had stumbled into the game by accident. He had been chosen. Marked. Given a piece of God's own power for reasons that had not been explained to him and that he had no memory of agreeing to. The other participants fought to survive the God game. Rei Yen was beginning to understand that he had been placed inside it as something more specific. A champion. A candidate. For a purpose that someone with incomprehensible power had decided without consulting him at all. The God game did not only consume ordinary mortals. Among the millions of participants were beings who had been worshipped by civilizations, who had shaped history and myth and the dreams of entire peoples across centuries. God used the game as a means to punish or execute deities he disliked, as well as to cull unworthy deities and select new ones. Norse gods. Greek gods. Eastern immortals. All stripped of their divine protections and forced to compete under the same brutal rules as everyone else. For Rei Yen, already carrying the weight of God's own eyes in his skull, discovering that the game was also a divine tribunal changed the scale of what he was surviving. He was not just a human in a death game. He was a piece on a board being played by something that considered gods disposable. Among the most powerful figures Rei Yen would encounter in the God game was Sun Wukong, the Monkey King. He arrived the way legends always arrive, completely and without apology, filling the space around him with an energy that was equal parts terrifying and absurdly magnetic. Sun Wukong had been many things across his long and violent history. A rebel. A prisoner. A pilgrim. A god. He had fought heaven itself and considered it a reasonable Tuesday. The God game, with all its rules and its divine orchestration, struck him as something worth engaging with at full force. His relationship with Rei Yen would not be simple. The most interesting things never are. But the Monkey King's presence shifted the entire balance of what the game was capable of becoming. The power had been there from the beginning. Rei Yen had felt it the way you feel something behind a door, present and real but contained. Each round had pushed him closer to the threshold. Each loss, each wound, each moment where holding back meant someone he cared about getting hurt, had been chipping away at whatever instinct or habit or fear was keeping the door closed. When it finally opened, it did not open quietly. The divine eyes blazed. The glaive sang. The power that God had placed inside him and whatever Rei Yen himself carried underneath the amnesia combined into something that the other participants, gods and monsters and warriors alike, were not prepared to face. The game had built him for this. He was beginning to understand why. Not everyone in the God game was simply trying to survive. Some had arrived with agendas that extended beyond the wish at the end of the final round. Among the most dangerous of these was the figure known as the daimyo, a presence defined by calculation rather than raw power, who had been working since the early rounds to position allies and assets across the game's various arenas. The daimyo understood something that most participants were too focused on immediate survival to recognize. The God game was not just a tournament. It was a system, and systems, no matter how divinely constructed, have pressure points. The question of who the daimyo truly was and what they intended to do with the one game was one of the most dangerous questions in play. He saw her across a battlefield that had no business being survived by either of them. Just for a moment. Just long enough for the fragment of memory that had been haunting him since the first round to lock into something real and present and breathing. She was alive. She was in the game. And the expression on her face when their eyes met told him that she recognized him too, that whatever had been done to his memory had not been done to hers in the same way, and that she had been looking for him just as desperately as he had been looking for her. The crowd moved. The round continued. She was gone again. But the thing that had been keeping Ray Yen functional in the abstract now had a face and a location. That changed everything about how he fought. As explained by Vidar, an Asur god, the god game served as a means to punish or execute deities that God disliked, as well as to cull unworthy deities and select new ones. But the full truth went further than even that. The game was a selection process for something Ray Yen had not yet been told. A reshaping of the divine hierarchy. A culling designed to produce not just a survivor with a wish, but a new order built from whoever proved themselves worthy of existing in the world that came after. Ray Yen had been entered as God's own candidate, which meant that his victory was not supposed to be a surprise. It was supposed to be a confirmation. And somewhere in the gap between what God intended and what Ray Yen himself intended, the purpose Ray Yen had chosen for himself was something else entirely: to kill God. Millions had entered the God game. What remained for the final rounds could be counted. Each surviving participant carried the weight of every round they had endured, every ally they had lost, every version of themselves they had been forced to become in order to still be standing. The game stripped away everything that was not essential and left only what survived the stripping. Ray Yen looked at the people still standing across from him and saw something the early rounds had not contained. Not strangers. Not simple opponents. People who had been tested by the same impossible standard and had, somehow, held. The final rounds would demand everything that remained. And God watched from above with the patience of something that had done this before, across other worlds, with other candidates, and had never yet been surprised by the outcome. The final stretch of the God game was not a single battle. It was a series of crucibles, each one designed to find and break the ceiling of what the participant thought they were capable of. Ray Yen moved through them with a clarity that the amnesia and the confusion and the fear of the earlier rounds had not allowed. He knew what he was fighting for. He knew what came after winning if his own plan rather than God's plan was the one that reached the end. Each opponent he faced was the best they had ever been. He had to be better. Not because the game required it, because the things waiting for him on the other side of victory, his sister, his own buried truth, the confrontation he had promised himself, required someone who had nothing left to prove to anyone except himself. Reaching her was not the end of anything. It was the beginning of a different kind of difficulty. His sister carried knowledge that Ray Yen's amnesia had hidden from him, knowledge about who they were before the game, about what had been done to both of them and why, about the relationship between their family and the God who had built this entire structure around them. What she told him did not break him. He had been built for hard truths, or rebuilt, or both. But it changed the shape of what he was carrying from that moment forward. The wish at the end of the game was no longer the point. It had not been the point for a long time. The point was standing at the end of everything and facing the being who had done all of this with something more than a request. God wore a glowing ethereal crown that appeared to float above his head, surrounded by an intimidating shadowy aura. He looked at Ray Yen the way a creator looks at a creation that has exceeded its parameters. Not angry. Almost impressed. Ray Yen did not speak. There was nothing to say that the glaive in his hands and the eyes blazing in his skull did not already communicate. Every round of the God game had been a step toward this moment. Every death, every revelation, every fragment of memory that had surfaced and settled into something resembling a self, God had built the game to select a champion. Ray Yen had survived it to become something the game was never designed to produce. Not a winner. Not a candidate. A reckoning. The God game ended. What came after was not a world that had been waiting tidily for the game to finish. It was a space that had to be decided, negotiated, built from whatever the surviving participants still had the will to build with. Ray Yen stood in the middle of it with his sister beside him and the weight of everything the game had cost pressing down on both of them in equal measure. He had not asked for any of this. The game had not cared what he asked for. But somewhere between waking up in chains with no name and no memory and standing here at the end of something that had consumed millions of lives, he had become someone who had chosen who he was rather than been assigned it. The void filled slowly with color. And Rayana Jura, if that was his real name, watched it happen and did not look away.